What does it take for a black woman to be believed in a system built to break her? To walk into a courtroom not as a victim, not as a criminal, but as her own last line of defense? When the world writes you off as a fraud before you utter your first word, how do you prove you're more than their stereotype? The elevator doors creaked open on the 3rd floor of the Franklin County Courthouse, and every eye in the hallway seemed to pause on her. Danielle Brooks stepped out slowly, heels clicking against the polished marble like a metronome in a hostile silence. Her hair, tightly braided into a crown around her head, glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights. She clutched a worn leather folder to her chest like a shield, not of fear, but of resolve. She had never been arrested in her life. Never seen the inside of a courtroom that wasn't on a television screen. But now she stood accused of wire fraud, computer fraud, and obstruction, felony charges that could tear her entire life apart. Her job, her home, her reputation, and the most sacred thing she had, her custody of her son, were all on the line. Just 2 months ago, she had been the director of community finance at Bridges for Change, a nonprofit that helped struggling families stay afloat. She'd worked day and night to stretch every dollar, to make sure rent relief and food vouchers landed in the right hands. Now, she was being paraded like a thief for daring to ask where the missing money went. And today, she would stand alone before a system that never gave her the benefit of the doubt. Inside courtroom 3B, Prosecutor Jackson Rourke leaned on the edge of the prosecution table with the lazy confidence of a man who'd grown up knowing he'd never be denied. His tailored navy blue suit hugged his frame like it was made to measure, because it was. His slicked back hair and gleaming wristwatch were the kind of details Danielle instantly recognized, privilege wrapped in polish. He didn't look up when she walked in. He didn't have to. In his eyes, she was already defeated. "Ms. Brooks," he called flatly, still scanning his notes. "Your court-appointed counsel isn't present." Again. Danielle stepped to the defense table and set her folder down with steady hands. "That's because I released him this morning," she said. "I'll be representing myself." That got Rourke's attention. He raised his head slowly, one eyebrow cocked with amused disbelief. "You have a law degree I don't know about?" "I don't," she replied. "But I do have a memory, a record of every communication that went ignored, and a paper trail your office clearly didn't think I'd keep." Rourke's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it widened. "Charming. I'm sure the jury will enjoy the performance." From the bench, Judge Jean DeWitt peered over her glasses with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Ms. Brooks, you understand you're facing 3 felony counts. If convicted, you could face up to 15 years in prison." Danielle nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I also understand that my court-appointed lawyer didn't know which nonprofit I worked for after 3 visits and didn't request a single document in my defense. So yes, I'll take my chances with myself." A low hum rippled through the room. One woman in the gallery, seated near the back with her arms crossed and eyes narrowed in solidarity, nodded quietly. Judge DeWitt exhaled slowly. "Very well. The court will honor your right to self-representation, but you will be held to the same standard as a licensed attorney." Danielle gave a single, confident nod. "I wouldn't want it any other way." By the lunch recess, the temperature in the courtroom had shifted. Danielle sat alone at the defense table, flipping through her handwritten notes with the focus of someone on a mission. On the other side, Rourke whispered to his intern, occasionally chuckling like he already had the verdict in hand. He'd called his first witness that morning, Stephen Carlson, Bridges for Change's former finance director. Carlson wore a polite, almost paternal smile as he took the stand, his balding head shining under the overhead lights. Carlson testified that Danielle had sole access to the nonprofit's disbursement software. He painted her as erratic, insubordinate, and overly aggressive about budget irregularities. He told the court that when funds began to vanish, it was Danielle's credentials logged into the system. Danielle didn't interrupt. She let him spin his web even when it threatened to strangle her. When it was finally her turn to cross-examine, she stood up with quiet intensity. "Mr. Carlson," she began, "how many people had administrative access to the CompuShield software used by Bridges for Change?" He hesitated. "Well, technically 4. Were those names ever included in the police report? I don't recall. Danielle held up a document. Let me help. This is the initial police report. It lists only my name. No mention of the other 3 individuals. Why is that? Carlson adjusted his tie. You were the only one with suspicious activity tied to your login. Danielle flipped another page. And can you confirm whether any third-party cybersecurity audit was ever conducted after the incident? No, he said stiffly. Did you notify the board about the missing funds? No. But you called the police about me? Yes. Danielle took a breath, then stepped closer to the evidence table. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit D, certified access logs from CompuShield obtained through a third-party subpoena. These logs show that 2 login sessions occurred during the same window as the unauthorized fund transfers. One of them wasn't mine. The IP address traces back to an internal administrative account belonging to Mr. Carlson. A beat of stunned silence filled the courtroom. Rourke stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not submitted during pretrial discovery. Danielle turned, calm and relentless. Because I had to request it myself. After my lawyer refused. Judge DeWitt motioned for the documents. She read through them silently, then looked up at Carlson, who had gone pale. Objection overruled, she said. The logs will be entered into the record. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with quiet chatter. Danielle descended slowly, her folder in hand, her back straight against the invisible weight of everything she carried. A reporter approached with a notepad. Ms. Brooks, any comment on your decision to defend yourself? Danielle stopped at the bottom step. Sometimes, you've got to be your own advocate. Especially when the system's designed to speak over you. The reporter hesitated, then asked the question everyone else was thinking. Do you think this case is about more than just fraud? Danielle looked past her toward the wide gray sky. This isn't just about fraud, she said. It's about erasure. It's about being underestimated. And it's about what happens when the people you think are silent decide to speak for themselves. Inside his office, Rourke poured himself a double shot of scotch and stared at the evidence printouts on his desk. His confidence, polished and rehearsed, had cracked for the first time in years. He didn't know it yet, but this case was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about control. And for the first time, he didn't have it. The courthouse cafeteria smelled like overcooked eggs and bureaucratic indifference. Danielle Brooks sat at a table near the far window, her back to the wall, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of weak coffee. Her folder lay open beside her, pages splayed like battle maps. She hadn't touched her muffin. She wasn't hungry, she was wired. Every nerve in her body buzzed with vigilance, because in a place like this, comfort was a trap. Across the room, a group of junior attorneys chuckled over their bagels, their laughter bouncing off the sterile white walls like echoes in a cave. One of them, blonde, blazer too big, fresh out of law school, glanced at Danielle and whispered something to the others. They all turned to look, then quickly turned back, pretending not to. Danielle exhaled, slow and measured. She'd seen those looks before. The condescension wrapped in curiosity. The assumptions stitched into polite smiles. They weren't surprised she was on trial, they were surprised she'd had the audacity to speak. She flipped a page in her folder and reread her notes on the nonprofit's internal email system. There was a pattern, subtle but consistent. Unauthorized password changes, odd login times, and financial transfers made right after those changes. The IT logs showed that her login had been used while she was clocked out, even on days when she was at her son's school or at a neighborhood council meeting. She'd documented everything. She had dates, times, screenshots. But facts weren't always enough. She knew the difference between having evidence and being believed. Back in courtroom 3B, Rourke strutted in 5 minutes late, sipping from a stainless steel tumbler and talking loudly on his phone. He ended the call only after making sure everyone had seen him. Danielle sat calmly at her table, watching him with the stillness of someone who had already heard every insult that could be thrown at her and had learned to let them fall like rain. Ready to get back to it? Rourke asked, flashing a smug grin as he slid into his seat. She didn't answer. She just opened her legal pad and clicked her pen. Judge DeWitt entered, her expression unreadable as always. She called for the next witness. Rourke called Rebecca Lindell, the organization's operations manager and a longtime friend of Stephen Carlson. Lindell walked to the stand with a grace that was almost rehearsed. She wore a charcoal gray pantsuit and pearls, her blonde hair tucked into a neat bun. Her voice was soft, professional, polished, designed to inspire confidence in strangers. Ms. Lindell, Rourke began smoothly, in your capacity as operations manager, were you ever made aware of discrepancies in the financial system before Ms. Brooks was terminated? Lindell nodded. Yes. I was alerted by our internal finance team. And who was named as the primary suspect? Danielle Brooks. And based on the records, who was the only individual with administrative access at the time of the transfers? Ms. Brooks. Danielle's jaw tightened. She knew what was coming. Rourke had no new facts, only a parade of familiar faces lined up to deliver a polished lie. When it was her turn, Danielle stood and approached slowly, her posture composed, her voice steady. Ms. Lindell, you testified that you were alerted by the finance team. Could you clarify who exactly alerted you? Stephen Carlson, she replied. And did you verify the information he gave you before passing it along to law enforcement? Lindell hesitated. No, I trusted his judgment. Danielle nodded. Were you aware that Mr. Carlson's administrative credentials were still active during the time of the unauthorized transfers? I was not informed of that. Interesting. And are you also aware that the organization's cybersecurity logs show your own login was used at least once during a questionable transaction window? Lindell blinked. That must be a mistake. Danielle didn't flinch. I've submitted the logs to the court. They're time-stamped and traceable. Rourke stood. Objection, speculative. Judge DeWitt raised a hand. Overruled. The logs are part of the record. Proceed. Danielle stepped closer to the witness stand. Ms. Lindell, is it possible that multiple people had access to the system under different login names, and that those credentials were used improperly? Lindell swallowed hard. I suppose it's possible. Danielle gave a polite smile. That's all I needed to know. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed louder than the fluorescent lights above. Danielle leaned against the marble wall, her fingers tight around her phone. She hadn't made a single call all week. She hadn't wanted her mother to worry. But now, she needed to hear a voice that didn't belong to a stranger in a robe or a prosecutor in a $1,000 suit. She dialed. Danielle? Her mother's voice answered, cautious but warm. Baby, is everything all right? I'm holding it together, Mama, she whispered. But it's getting harder. The pause. You keep fighting. You were born to fight with truth, not fists. That court don't know who they're up against. Danielle blinked away tears. They think I'm just some angry black woman who doesn't know her place. Good, her mother replied firmly. Let them. That makes it hurt more when you win. Danielle chuckled softly, her first laugh in days. I miss you. I miss you too. Now go do what you do best. Make M regret ever picking the wrong woman to lie about. Inside Rourke's office, the atmosphere had shifted. His intern hovered nervously beside his desk, watching him flip through the access logs Danielle had entered into evidence. His brow furrowed deeper with every page. He hadn't expected this. He'd assumed this would be a fast-track conviction, another checkmark on his political resume. She's not just lucky, the intern said quietly. She's good. Rourke slammed the folder shut. She's reckless. And she's going to get caught in her own trap. But even he didn't sound convinced. That evening, Danielle sat at her kitchen table under the dim glow of a single overhead bulb. Her son, Malik, was fast asleep in the next room, curled up in Spider-Man pajamas with a worn teddy bear under one arm. She took a sip of cold tea and opened a new folder. This one contained internal memos, carefully saved from the nonprofit's shared drive. One memo in particular stood out. It was a forwarded email from Carlson to Lindell, marked private, with the subject line, "We need to clean this up before the board catches wind." She highlighted it, heart pounding. This was the crack in the wall. She just needed to keep digging. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage disguised as focus. For years, she had played by the rules, followed protocol, waited her turn, trusted systems. But now she knew better. Systems weren't designed to protect women like her. They were designed to test them, break them, silence them. But Danielle Brooks wasn't going to be broken. Not now, not ever. The air in the courtroom felt heavier that morning, as though the walls themselves had grown tired of holding secrets. Danielle Brooks entered through the rear doors without fanfare, her leather folder pressed tightly to her chest, her face composed but unsmiling. She wore a dark green blouse, simple and pressed, with a tiny pin in the shape of Africa just above her heart. That pin had belonged to her grandmother, who had cleaned houses for 40 years and died believing her granddaughter would rise above it all. Today, Danielle carried that belief into a courtroom built to erase it. Prosecutor Rourke stood by the bench, shoulders back, jaw set, pacing like a boxer waiting for the bell. He looked calmer than he had the day before, but only on the surface. Danielle could see the tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip he had on his pen, the way he kept glancing at the jury box as if trying to read minds. Judge DeWitt entered and nodded for everyone to be seated. "Ms. Brooks," she said without preamble, "you may proceed with your next witness." Danielle rose slowly, her voice clear and grounded. "Your Honor, the defense calls Kyle Harper to the stand." There was a shift in the room. Heads turned. Rourke's brows twitched. Kyle Harper was a name that hadn't been mentioned in the prosecution's opening arguments, but Danielle had found his connection buried deep in old payroll records, one of many names Carlson had hired on a temporary consulting basis during the same period the funds had disappeared. A man in his late 30s stood from the gallery and walked to the stand, his posture nervous but cooperative. He wore a faded button-up shirt and khakis that hung a little too loose, like he'd borrowed them for the occasion. His hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in. Danielle approached, her notes in hand. "Mr. Harper, please state your occupation for the record." "I'm an IT technician," he said. "Mostly freelance. I take contract work." "And were you ever contracted by Bridges for change?" "Yes. For about 2 months last year." "Do you recall who requested your services?" "Stephen Carlson," he answered, eyes flicking toward the prosecution's table. Rourke didn't flinch, but his intern scribbled something fast in the legal pad. "And what were you hired to do?" Harper hesitated. "To reconfigure the administrative permissions in their software platform." Danielle paused. "To clarify, you were paid to change who could access the financial records?" Harper nodded. "Yes." "Were you ever told why this change was being made?" Carlson said they were restructuring and that certain roles were being phased out. Danielle stepped closer, her voice still calm but gaining heat. "Did he mention Danielle Brooks by name?" Harper swallowed. "Yes. He said she was being watched, and they needed a way to override her settings without alerting her." A collective gasp broke across the courtroom like a wave. The bailiff looked toward the gallery, ready to calm the noise, but Judge DeWitt allowed it to settle on its own. Danielle continued. "Mr. Harper, do you have any documentation to support this claim?" Harper reached into his coat pocket and removed a printed email. "This is a confirmation message from Carlson, confirming the scope of my work and payment. It references Danielle Brooks by name." Danielle took the email carefully and handed it to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I submit this as Defense Exhibit G." Judge DeWitt accepted the document, her expression unreadable but sharpened. "Objection," Rourke barked. "This was not disclosed in pretrial." Danielle turned to him, her eyes firm. "Because no one in your office ever bothered to request the full payroll records. You've had the subpoenaed bank statements for 2 weeks. His name was there. You missed it." Judge DeWitt looked down at the document, then at Rourke. "Objection overruled." Danielle turned back to Harper. "Did Mr. Carlson ever ask you to delete logs or hide the changes you made?" Harper looked down. "Yes. He said it was a security protocol." "Did that seem strange to you?" "Yes. That's why I kept a copy of the admin log before I deleted it." Danielle stepped back, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. No further questions. During the lunch recess, Rourke stormed down the back hallway, his face tight with rage. He slammed the door of the prosecution office behind him, pacing in furious circles. "She's not supposed to be this smart," he hissed. "She's not a lawyer, she's a financial clerk from the South Side." His intern didn't respond. He was too busy rereading Harper's testimony, already watching the case unravel in slow motion. "She's showing them she's credible," the intern finally said. "And you're treating her like a joke. That's not working anymore." Rourke whipped around. "You're saying this is my fault? I'm saying she's building a narrative, and it's working. She's not just defending herself, she's exposing them." Rourke exhaled, loud and ragged. "Then we bury her. We dig into her personal finances, we find inconsistencies, we flip this before she gets to closing arguments." "But what if there's nothing there?" "There's always something," Rourke snapped. Later that afternoon, Danielle sat alone in a quiet corner of the library, her hands cramping from hours of note-taking, her eyes bloodshot, her thoughts wrapped in every detail Harper had given her. She'd known Carlson was behind the sabotage, but to hear it confirmed in sworn testimony changed everything. Still, it wasn't just about proving a setup, it was about connecting the dots in a way that forced the jury to see the pattern. The memo from Lindell, the admin changes Harper made, the financial discrepancies that mysteriously lined up with bonus payments to Carlson, it was all pointing toward a coordinated effort to frame her and cover internal theft. But something still felt incomplete. She opened a side folder labeled Carlson Bonus Logs. At the bottom of the printout was a line item, an $18,500 bonus issued on the same day as the largest fraudulent transfer. She cross-checked the timing against the admin access logs. It matched. But what stood out now more than ever was that the bonus had been approved not just by Carlson, but countersigned electronically by Lindell. Danielle's breath caught. This wasn't just incompetence. It was conspiracy. The next day, as the courtroom slowly filled, Danielle stood outside near the courthouse steps, watching the traffic pass. Her son's school had emailed her a drawing he'd made in class, a picture of her in a superhero cape, standing in front of a building with scales above the door. She held the drawing in her hand, its crayon lines uneven but full of hope. "You still sure you want to do this alone?" asked a voice behind her. She turned to find Sergeant Claudia Monroe from the local precinct, an old friend of her late brother. Claudia had always watched out for her, always believed her. "I'm not alone," Danielle said quietly, still staring at the drawing. "I've just stopped waiting for someone else to fight for me." Claudia nodded slowly. "Then finish what you started." As the gavel fell and the judge entered for the next session, Rourke watched Danielle from across the aisle, his mask beginning to crack. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, tried to crush her. But now, for the first time, he realized he hadn't been prosecuting a case. He'd been playing defense against a woman who refused to be erased. And with every page, every piece of evidence, every question asked with razor-sharp clarity, Danielle Brooks was showing the court, and the world, that truth does not require permission to speak. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the thick, oppressive kind. The silence that sinks into your skin, presses on your ribs, and tells you that something is coming, something big enough to break everything wide open. Danielle Brooks sat alone at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly around a worn blue pen that had nearly run out of ink. She didn't need it to write anymore. Every name, every date, every detail she'd memorized lived in her now. That pen had become something else, something symbolic. It was a piece of home, a gift from her son's first teacher with the words, "You are enough," printed down the barrel in fading silver. She held on to it like a lifeline, not because it would win the case, but because it reminded her who she was fighting for. Judge DeWitt entered promptly at 9, her robe rustling like dry leaves in the fall. She adjusted her glasses and glanced first at Danielle, then at Rourke, then toward the half-full jury box. "Are both parties prepared to proceed?" Danielle nodded once, controlled and steady. Rourke stood with a false air of ease, hiding the fatigue in his eyes behind a strained smirk. He had spent the entire previous night digging through Danielle's past, searching for any mistake, any slip, any trace of something that could make her look unstable or dishonest. He'd found none. The prosecutor's file on Danielle was clean, too clean. It unnerved him. "Your Honor," Rourke began, "the prosecution calls Officer Nathan Dent to the stand." Danielle's eyes narrowed as a uniformed officer entered from the side door. Tall, white, with a sharp military buzz cut and eyes that scanned the courtroom like a threat assessment, Officer Dent was the arresting officer in Danielle's case. Danielle had read the report he'd filed, and it had taken her hours to find the inconsistencies. The version he wrote had been tidy, confident, and devastating, just like his testimony would attempt to be. Dent took the oath without hesitation and sat down, posture ramrod straight. "Officer Dent," Rourke began, "can you walk the court through the circumstances surrounding Ms. Brooks' arrest?" Dent launched into a rehearsed narrative. He described receiving a tip from the nonprofit's leadership, the issuance of a warrant, and how Danielle had resisted providing her passwords and account access. He mentioned her combative tone and the hostile environment during questioning. He never once mentioned that she had asked for legal counsel multiple times and had been ignored. When Danielle rose for cross-examination, her entire body was electric with suppressed outrage. She walked slowly toward Dent, not like a woman intimidated by a badge, but like one who had been carrying the weight of its abuse far too long. "Officer Dent," she said evenly, "you stated that I resisted providing my account information. Can you clarify what that resistance looked like?" Dent shrugged. "You refused to hand over your laptop. I asked if you had a warrant. Did you?" "No. We were operating under verbal consent from the organization's legal counsel." "Verbal consent from someone who had no authority over my personal device," Danielle corrected, eyes locked on him. "So you entered my home, demanded I give you access to a private device, without a warrant or legal authority to do so?" Dent shifted. "We believed the device contained evidence. But you didn't have a legal right to seize it." Rourke stood. "Objection, argumentative." Judge DeWitt glanced over. "Sustained. Rephrase." Danielle took a breath. "Officer Dent, are you aware that under both state and federal law, accessing a private citizen's device without a warrant constitutes a violation of the Fourth Amendment?" Dent hesitated. "I acted under instructions from my superior." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Yes," Dent finally said. Danielle nodded. "So you admit that the evidence you gathered from my personal computer was obtained unlawfully?" Rourke jumped up again. "Objection. That's a legal conclusion." Danielle turned calmly. "Your Honor, I'm asking for clarity on the officer's understanding of his own actions. I'm not rendering legal judgment." Judge DeWitt leaned back slowly. "I'll allow it." Dent looked uncomfortable now, his uniform suddenly tighter, the badge on his chest a little heavier. Danielle continued. "Did you log any chain of custody report after seizing my computer?" "No," he said, voice flatter. "Did you preserve the original data, or did anyone else at your precinct access the files without supervision?" Dent remained silent. "I'll take that as a no." The tension in the courtroom now sat thick in everyone's lungs. Danielle turned to the jury, her voice calm but resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider this. If the process to arrest me was flawed, if the data used to justify it was unlawfully gathered, and if the people leading the investigation were acting on the word of those with something to hide, what does that say about the foundation of this entire case?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her truth was sharp enough to cut on its own. In the hallway after the recess, Rourke slammed his case binder shut and cursed under his breath. "Why didn't Dent mention any of that to me before?" he barked. His intern didn't look up. "Because you didn't ask." Rourke's face twisted, the arrogance that once propped him up now buckling under the weight of his mistakes. He had built his entire strategy around dismissing Danielle as someone who didn't belong in a courtroom, someone who would collapse under pressure, someone who couldn't possibly win. But she wasn't collapsing. She was climbing. Danielle sat outside on the stone steps of the courthouse, the city humming behind her like a song she no longer danced to. She closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face, just for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her inbox until she found the email she'd been saving. It was from a whistleblower, An anonymous tip from someone inside the nonprofit who had reached out after the story hit the local paper. The message was short, the words cautious, but the contents were explosive. Check the board meeting minutes from January. Carlson motioned for an emergency budget shift that never got approved. Lindell signed off anyway. The minutes were altered before filing. I have the originals. Danielle's heart beat faster as she read it again. If what this person said was true, she had the final piece, proof that not only had she been framed, but the cover-up went higher than Carlson or Lindell. This was board-level fraud, and she was about to shine a spotlight on it in front of the entire courtroom. That night, Danielle stood in her tiny kitchen, holding her son's drawing in one hand and her closing notes in the other. Malik sat at the table, quietly coloring, his tiny shoulders rising and falling as he hummed to himself. She walked over and kissed the top of his head. "Mommy's almost done," she whispered. He looked up and smiled. "Did you win yet?" "Not yet," she replied, eyes misting. "But I'm getting close." Truth doesn't always knock on the front door. It slips in through a crack, quiet but undeniable, carrying with it the kind of light that makes shadows nervous. Danielle Brooks stood just inside her apartment, phone in one hand, printouts in the other, heart thudding loud enough to drown out the buzz of the refrigerator. The email had come through at midnight, anonymous but specific, precise enough to sound like someone who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The sender had attached scanned images, real, unredacted board meeting minutes from Bridges for Change, dated 2 weeks before the financial irregularities began. In the official version, nothing had seemed out of place: standard budgeting approvals, vague financial projections, Carlson's usual business jargon. But the version Danielle now held in her hand told a different story. A motion had been pushed through to approve an emergency reallocation of untracked relief funds by Carlson, with a second from Lindell. The vote had failed. 3 board members voted no, 1 abstained, and 2 were absent. The motion was never supposed to pass. Yet somehow, just days later, those funds were moved. Even more damning, the metadata on the scanned documents showed that the digital copies were edited 2 days after the meeting, then re-uploaded to the nonprofit's internal server by a user under Lindell's login. Danielle's hands trembled, not from fear, but from a surge of clarity so sharp it felt like electricity through her veins. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate. This was criminal. The following morning, Danielle arrived at the courthouse an hour early, dressed in all black, hair pulled into a neat bun that framed her face with unapologetic pride. She moved with purpose, each step echoing through the marble halls like the countdown to something no one could stop. The courtroom was quiet when she entered. The clerk greeted her with a nod that carried more respect than it had in previous days. Even Judge DeWitt's tone shifted slightly when she entered the chamber, still formal, still neutral, but touched with something Danielle couldn't quite name. Maybe curiosity. Maybe reverence. Across the aisle, Rourke sat scribbling furiously, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck pulsed with visible tension. He was losing grip of the narrative, and he knew it. The jury had begun leaning forward when Danielle spoke, their eyes following her as if she were the one wearing the robe. "Ms. Brooks," Judge DeWitt said, "do you have additional evidence to submit?" "I do, Your Honor." Danielle walked to the bench, her folder steady in her grip. She handed over 2 sets of documents, one marked Exhibit H, the other Exhibit I. As the judge examined the contents, Rourke stood quickly. "Objection," he said, trying to steady his voice. These documents were not included in the defense's original evidence disclosures. Danielle didn't even turn to him, because the originals were suppressed. The copies provided to your office had been edited. These are the unaltered minutes, provided by a protected source. Judge DeWitt's eyes narrowed. "Where did you obtain them?" "The source has requested anonymity for safety," Danielle replied. "But the digital signatures and metadata confirm these files predate the versions your office received. The changes are evident, and the vote count discrepancy is documented." Rourke opened his mouth again, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. "I'll review the chain of custody later. For now, the court will accept the documents conditionally and review admissibility during deliberation." Danielle turned to the jury. This shows that the $50,000 at the center of this case was never legally approved for reallocation. The people who signed off on it, Carlson and Lindell, overrode board authority and then edited the documentation to cover their tracks. These transactions were framed as my doing, but I had no administrative authority at that point. The system shows that my access had been downgraded days before. She walked slowly in front of the jury box, not pacing, just grounding each word. Not only did I not steal anything, I was removed from the loop before the theft even occurred. And when I raised concerns about missing funds, they made sure the spotlight shifted from the crime to the one asking questions. One juror, a middle-aged black woman in a red scarf, blinked rapidly and looked down. A young Latino man near the end of the row nodded once, slow and deliberate. During the break, Rourke paced behind the courthouse. The wind picked up, stirring the leaves into circles near his feet, but he barely noticed. His phone buzzed in his pocket for the third time. It was his supervisor, probably sensing that things were spiraling. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He had staked his career on this case, had called in favors, had written op-eds about the need for financial accountability in grassroots organizations. He had mocked her to his peers, had rolled his eyes when she chose to defend herself, had bragged that she would crumble the moment he pressed her on cross. And now she was dismantling him, one exhibit at a time. He had walked into this courtroom a lion. Now he was just prey in a suit. Inside, Danielle sat in the empty gallery, scrolling through her phone. Another email had come through, short, typed in all lowercase. You were right. They planned it. Check the files from the October retreat. Budget forecast was a cover. Good luck. She exhaled slowly, chest heavy but heart steady. This case had started with numbers, but it had always been about something more. It was about whose voice was allowed to matter, whose truth was allowed to be heard, who had the right to defend themselves, not just legally, but morally, fully, as a human being. When court resumed, Rourke made a desperate move. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call a rebuttal witness. We believe Ms. Brooks has misrepresented her conduct during the internal audit. Judge DeWitt tilted her head slightly. Do you have someone ready to testify? Yes. Ms. Rachel Benton, former administrative assistant at Bridges for Change. Danielle froze. Rachel had worked closely with Carlson, had always been polite but distant, the kind of person who followed power without question. Rachel took the stand, nervous but composed. Ms. Benton, Rourke began, did you ever witness Ms. Brooks behaving erratically or aggressively toward her colleagues? Rachel paused. She was passionate, intense, sometimes, but not aggressive. Rourke blinked. Did you ever feel unsafe? No. Did you ever hear her threaten to take down the board? Rachel shook her head. No. She asked questions. Loud ones. But they were always about missing money. Danielle watched Rachel closely, her breathing even. Rourke tried again. Did she ever suggest she would sabotage the organization to make a point? No, Rachel said, firmer now. She warned that if something didn't change, someone would get hurt. Not because of her, but because of the fraud. She was trying to protect people. Rourke's face hardened. No further questions, he said. Danielle stood. Ms. Benton, if you were given a subpoena for all internal emails between Carlson and Lindell regarding the October board retreat, would you comply? Rachel hesitated. Yes, she said. I'll send them tonight. Danielle nodded. Thank you. That evening, Danielle sat on her front porch, sipping warm chamomile tea, staring at the stars. Malik slept peacefully inside, curled under the blanket they had picked out together at a yard sale. The night was cool, almost quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the wind against the trees. She opened her laptop and began organizing her closing statement. She was tired, but she was ready, because what she had built wasn't just a defense. It was a mirror held up to a system that never expected a black woman to fight back, and certainly not with grace, with evidence, with unrelenting truth. The courtroom felt colder that morning, not in temperature, but in anticipation, the kind that settles over a space right before something permanent happens, something that cannot be undone. Danielle Brooks stood just outside the double doors of courtroom 3B, her palms pressed together, not in prayer exactly, but in preparation. She inhaled deeply through her nose, held the breath in her chest, then exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if releasing all the fear that had tried to crawl inside her during the long nights of research, of pacing, of wiping away quiet tears alone in her living room. Today was the closing argument. Today, she would speak her last words to the jury, to the judge, to the very institution that had treated her not as a citizen presumed innocent, but as a woman presumed dangerous the moment she chose to speak on her own behalf. The doors creaked open, and Danielle walked through them with her head high, her footsteps firm, the echo of her heels announcing her presence like a gavel before the verdict. Inside, the jurors watched her closely now, no longer with the distance of strangers, but with the eyes of people who had witnessed a transformation they never expected. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Rourke sat quietly, his posture still upright, but the usual air of superiority around him had dulled, like a suit that had been worn too long without care. His notes were scattered, his pen uncapped but untouched. He looked not at Danielle, but at the table, as though he feared what he might see in her eyes. Judge DeWitt gave a brief nod. "Ms. Brooks, you may proceed with your closing argument." Danielle stood slowly, adjusted the edge of her blazer, and stepped toward the center of the room. She didn't bring a stack of papers. She didn't need one. Everything she had to say was already carved into her. She looked directly at the jury. "When I walked into this courtroom 2 weeks ago," she began, her voice calm but full, "I knew what most of you saw." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "You saw a black woman, alone at the defense table, no lawyer at her side, no legal degree hanging behind her, no title of authority stamped on her name. You saw someone who must have done something wrong, because why else would she be standing here with so much at stake and no one to protect her?" A few jurors shifted, the weight of her words settling in their laps like truth they didn't want to hold but couldn't put down. "I saw it in your eyes," Danielle continued, her gaze soft but unwavering. "I've seen it my entire life. I saw it when I tried to report missing funds at Bridges for change and was told to stop asking questions. I saw it when I asked my court-appointed attorney to investigate the documents and he told me to just take the plea deal. And I saw it when Officer Dent came into my home without a warrant, without a reason, without an ounce of respect." She turned, her voice growing in strength without ever rising in volume. "But let me be clear. I did not come here to make you feel guilty. I came here to make you see." She stepped closer to the jury box now, her hands open at her sides. "This trial was never about whether or not money went missing. It did. The question was who took it, and why they wanted to blame me." She pointed gently to the projector screen behind her, where the judge had allowed her to display the board meeting minutes, the IP logs, the email from the whistleblower, each piece of evidence that dismantled the story Rourke had tried to sell. "Stephen Carlson," she said, "fabricated records, hired outside help to alter financial access, then covered his trail by altering board minutes that had already rejected his motion to move those funds. Rachel Lindell signed off on that motion anyway, despite the vote. They changed the digital files. We have proof. We have metadata. We have the real documents." She took another breath, slower now. "Then, when I asked where the money had gone, they used my name, my access history, and their power to turn suspicion into an arrest. They called the police. They handed them doctored reports. And they knew that once I was in that chair, defending myself, the system would do the rest." Her voice caught, just slightly, but she did not stop. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I've never stood in a courtroom before this. I didn't know how to cross-examine, how to submit evidence, how to argue my own innocence. But what I did know was the truth. I knew how to read. I knew how to research. I knew how to hold on when everything inside me wanted to scream." She turned slightly, gesturing to the bench where Rourke sat, now visibly sweating. "And my accuser, the man who tried to silence me, who laughed when I said I'd represent myself, he's been quiet lately. Because even he knows that this is no longer about credentials or court procedures. It's about justice." She walked one step closer to the jury. "It's about whether a person like me, black, female, unconnected, can walk into a place like this and be heard, not dismissed, not patronized, not humiliated, but heard. A hush fell over the room so heavy, it swallowed breath. Danielle looked at each juror, one by one. "If you believe the evidence," she said, "you must acquit. If you believe the truth, you must acquit. If you believe that integrity matters more than power, that facts matter more than privilege, and that courage sometimes looks like a woman standing alone, then I ask you, do not let them bury me just because I refuse to stay quiet." She took one final breath. "Thank you." And then she sat down. Rourke rose next, visibly shaken. His closing was short, filled with desperate half-measures and vague suggestions that maybe, possibly, the data could be misinterpreted, that Danielle had access and that access implied responsibility. But even he sounded unsure of himself. His voice lacked conviction, his argument lacked weight. He ended with a hollow phrase, "This case is about accountability." Danielle didn't flinch. She had already shown the jury what real accountability looked like. The courtroom adjourned for deliberation. The jury filed out silently. Judge DeWitt nodded toward Danielle, an almost imperceptible show of respect, then stepped down from the bench. Danielle remained seated, alone at the defense table. Her hands trembled now, the adrenaline fading, the weight of it all crashing down at once. But still, she did not cry. She had held her composure through the fire. She would hold it through the waiting. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed. Reporters buzzed. Cameras flashed. A few supporters held signs that read truth over titles and let her speak. Danielle's name was beginning to trend online, not because she had a fancy lawyer or a high-profile sponsor, but because she had stood, calmly and bravely, against the machine, and made it blink first. She did not speak to the press. She simply held her son's hand, who had been brought to the courthouse by her mother, and walked down the steps into the cool afternoon sun. For now, the world could wait. She had already said what needed to be said. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in courtrooms after closing arguments. A silence that does not soothe, does not invite peace, but instead feels like something watching, waiting, calculating. Danielle Brooks sat at the defense table, her hands resting gently in her lap, her body still as stone, her mind moving like a train without brakes. The courtroom was half empty now, the media gone for the moment, the murmuring spectators reduced to quiet watchers who understood they were standing in the shadow of something irreversible. Hours had passed since the jury had retreated behind the thick wooden doors that separated decision from destiny. Hours that moved like molasses, dragging every minute across her nerves. Her fingers occasionally twitched, but her face remained unreadable, composed, resolved. She had said everything she could say. She had exposed everything she could expose. The rest now sat in the hands of 12 people, each carrying the weight of her life like a stone in their pocket. Her son, Malik, had stayed home that morning. She had kissed him on the forehead before the sun came up, whispered a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, that she'd be home for dinner, that this would all be over, that the truth would be enough. Across the room, Rourke sat hunched over his notes, flipping through them with a nervous energy he could no longer hide. His usual swagger had evaporated, leaving behind only agitation, a simmering panic thinly veiled by muttered frustration. He had seen it coming. The collapse. The unraveling. The look in the jury's eyes when Danielle had spoken to them like equals, like human beings, like people who could understand pain and injustice and fight for something better. Judge DeWitt entered quietly, her robe trailing behind her, her expression impossible to read. "The jury has reached a verdict," she said. The words dropped into the room like a stone into a still lake, sending invisible ripples into every corner. Danielle did not move. She felt her breath rise and fall, slow, intentional, almost forced. Her heart beat loud in her ears, but she didn't let it show. She kept her chin high, her spine straight, her spirit braced for both freedom and fire. The door to the jury room opened, and one by one, they filed in. 12 faces. 12 minds. 12 verdicts hidden behind controlled expressions. The foreperson, a bespectacled man in his early 40s, held a folded slip of paper. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Every eye followed the small piece of paper as if it were sacred, because in that moment, it was. It carried judgment. It carried consequences. Judge DeWitt unfolded it, read it silently, then handed it back without changing her face. Will the defendant please rise? Danielle stood slowly, her legs strong, her hands at her sides, her gaze straight ahead. In the matter of the state versus Danielle Brooks, the foreperson said, on the charge of embezzlement and wire fraud, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. The air snapped. Someone gasped audibly in the gallery. Someone else cried. A few reporters rushed out the doors to break the news. But Danielle did not move. She stood, rooted, staring forward, the words taking a full 5 seconds to land fully in her chest. Not guilty. Not a criminal. Not the liar they had painted. Not the scapegoat they had built this case on. Her hands trembled, not with fear now, but with a release so powerful it nearly broke her in half. She didn't smile. Not yet. The relief came in waves, quiet and deep, like a tide coming in after a storm that had almost drowned her. Judge DeWitt cleared her throat. Ms. Brooks, you are free to go. The court acknowledges the strength and clarity with which you defended yourself. This case is adjourned. The gavel fell like thunder. And just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, the world was already spinning. Camera crews lined the sidewalk, their lenses trained on the exit, waiting for Danielle's face. Reporters shouted her name, trying to make her their headline. Protesters and supporters clapped as she stepped into the sunlight, the noise around her swelling like a wave. But Danielle didn't raise her hands. She didn't pump her fist. She simply walked down the stairs slowly, quietly, her head held high, as if she were walking out of a battlefield, not a courtroom. She reached the street and saw her mother waiting near the corner, holding Malik in her arms. The moment their eyes met, Malik broke into a sprint, arms wide, tears already forming. "Mama," he cried. Danielle dropped to her knees and caught him in her arms, holding him so tightly she feared she might never let go. She pressed her face into his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his skin, the truth of his laughter, the safety of his small arms wrapped around her neck. Her mother stood behind them, hands clasped, tears streaking her cheeks, nodding slowly, silently, as if saying, "You did it, baby. You did it." Later that evening, Danielle sat on her porch with a blanket draped over her shoulders, her son asleep inside, the lights off, the world outside quiet at last. She stared up at the stars, no longer searching for answers, just grateful that she could finally see them again without fear. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was a message from a woman she had never met. "My name is Tasha. I watched your case online. I'm facing a similar situation. No one believes me. Can you help me figure out where to start?" Danielle stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed slowly. "Start with what you know is true. Then never stop fighting until they hear you." She hit send. Then she sat back, exhaled deeply, and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in months. Peace, not the kind that whispers, but the kind that roars. Freedom doesn't always feel like joy. Sometimes it feels like silence, long and wide, stretching into the parts of you that were bruised by hope. 3 days after the verdict, Danielle Brooks sat in the back booth of a quiet cafe on the edge of downtown, her fingers wrapped around a chipped porcelain mug of bitter black coffee, untouched. She watched the traffic roll by outside the rain-dusted window, each car a blur of movement, each pedestrian just another body marching on, unaware that for her, the world had shifted. Not with confetti, not with applause, but with truth, slow and heavy, like the pulling away of a stone wall that had been pressed against her chest for far too long. Across from her sat Rachel Benton, the former administrative assistant at Bridges for Change. Rachel wore a gray cardigan, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, the weight of complicity hanging in her posture. "I didn't know everything," Rachel said, her voice soft, barely louder than the hum of the espresso machine behind them. "I knew something was wrong, I knew they were covering things, but I never imagined they'd frame you. I thought you'd just get fired." Danielle didn't look at her. She stared at her coffee instead, listening to the way Rachel's voice trembled, not from fear, not even from guilt, but from discomfort, The kind that settles into people who never thought they'd have to pick a side until silence became betrayal. Rachel continued, "I'm sorry, Danielle. Truly." Danielle finally lifted her eyes, meeting Rachel's across the small table. "Sorry doesn't fix what they almost did to me," she said, calmly, not cruelly, but with the gravity of a woman who had almost lost her life to a lie. Rachel swallowed hard. "I'm willing to testify if they reopen the case against Carlson." Danielle nodded. "They will. The DA's office called me yesterday. Now that I've been cleared, there's an internal review. That email you gave on the October budget meeting, it's evidence." Rachel looked relieved but also exposed. She knew she had crossed a line, one she couldn't uncross. "You think they'll charge him?" she asked. Danielle didn't blink. "They don't have a choice anymore." That same afternoon, inside the sleek glass offices of the Franklin County Prosecutor's office, Jason Rourke stood by the large floor-to-ceiling window of his boss's office, arms crossed, face pale. The city skyline stretched out before him like a judgment he could no longer avoid. Behind him, Deputy District Attorney Melinda Parrish leafed through a printed report, her lips pressed into a firm, disapproving line. "You humiliated this office," she said without looking up. "You took a high-profile case built on falsified evidence and you let it go to trial without vetting your own witnesses. Then you got dragged in open court by a woman with no legal degree who exposed misconduct not just in the nonprofit, but in your own department." Rourke turned slowly, his jaw clenching. "She's manipulative. She's brilliant," Parrish cut him off sharply. "She's honest. And she did what we failed to do. She told the damn truth. You know what the public sees now? They see a black woman who defended herself better than most attorneys I've ever trained. They see you as a bully who didn't do his homework." He tried to speak again, but the room went cold. "You're suspended, pending review. Clean out your desk." He didn't argue. He knew better. The only thing left in his control was how quickly he disappeared. Meanwhile, at Bridges for Change, chaos had taken root. Stephen Carlson had been placed on administrative leave, though his attorney was already threatening to sue for defamation. Lindell had deleted her social media and had not been seen at the office since the verdict. 3 board members resigned. Donors began pulling their funding, refusing to back an organization now riddled with scandal. Danielle watched the fallout quietly, not with vengeance, not with triumph, but with clarity. She didn't want their careers destroyed, didn't care about dragging anyone through the mud. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was accountability. A formal audit was launched. The whistleblower, known only as Jay, submitted their full cache of emails and internal memos to a newly assigned investigator. Danielle wasn't part of the investigation, but she was its spark, its flame, the match that had been struck against years of dry lies. Later that week, Danielle received a package at her door. No return address. Inside was a thin manila envelope containing a handwritten letter. "You don't know me, but I worked in legal compliance at Bridges for Change. I stayed quiet when they lied. I watched them falsify reports. I heard them joke about how easy it would be to pin it all on you. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. But you changed everything. Thank you for standing up when we all sat down." Danielle folded the letter carefully, tears stinging her eyes, not because of pain, not even because of sorrow, but because of recognition, of the lonely kind of courage it takes to stand in truth when silence has always been safer. The following Sunday, Danielle took Malik to the park. The sun was warm, the breeze soft. She watched him run across the grass in a red hoodie 2 sizes too big, arms stretched like wings, laughter rising like music from a child too young to understand how close he'd come to losing his mother. A woman approached her quietly, holding the hand of a girl in pigtails. She was in her 50s, wearing a navy coat, her eyes cautious but kind. "You're Danielle Brooks," the woman said. Danielle turned, nodded slowly. "I just wanted to say thank you. I sat through your trial. I've never seen anything like that before. The way you stood up there, alone, but never small, you gave women like me a voice." Danielle didn't know what to say. So she offered what she had, honesty. "I was scared every single day," she said. "But I knew if I let them silence me, they'd silence every woman who came after me." The woman nodded, eyes glassy. She reached out, gently touched Danielle's arm, then walked away with her daughter, who waved before skipping toward the swings. That night, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, not from her case, but from others. Women had begun sending her letters, some handwritten, some typed, asking for help, for guidance, for courage. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't have a blueprint. But she had survived the fire, and now she had the tools to help others walk through their own. She pulled out a legal pad and began writing the words that would form the foundation of a new path, one built not from bitterness, but from purpose. Because after the verdict comes the reckoning. And after the reckoning comes the rebuilding. Some stories end in a verdict, but Danielle Brooks' story did not. Her victory had not been a finish line, not a fade-to-black triumph wrapped in applause, but rather a door cracked open, behind which echoed 1,000 other stories like hers, unheard, unspoken, unfinished. Every time she breathed in the quiet, every time she stared into the ceiling at night, she could hear them, whispers of women silenced by courtrooms, families torn apart by unfounded charges, mothers who never got the chance to clear their names. So when the media noise died down and the headlines moved on to the next scandal, Danielle didn't rest. She organized. It started in the basement of her old church, the one her grandmother had once cleaned every Sunday morning before service, humming hymns under her breath. The folding chairs were dented, the coffee was weak, the space smelled faintly of dust and varnish, but to Danielle, it felt like the most powerful courtroom she had ever walked into. At first, it was just 7 women, all sitting in a circle, some with manila folders, some with tear-streaked cheeks, some with stories that had been sitting in their throats like fire for years. A single mother accused of Medicaid fraud because she'd used her sister's address to get her child into a better school district. A nurse falsely blamed for missing drugs in her clinic when the real thief was a supervisor with access and immunity. A young teacher who had lost her job after being scapegoated for a misfiled grant by her principal. Each one of them had stood at the edge of the same cliff Danielle had once teetered on, and now, finally, they had someone to talk to, someone who had not only survived, but won. Danielle named the group Reclaim Justice. Not because it sounded powerful, but because it was the only thing she could think of that explained what they were really doing, taking back what had been stolen, word by word, case by case, voice by voice. Within weeks, the basement meetings outgrew their space. Local reporters who had first dismissed Danielle as just another courtroom curiosity now showed up with cameras, notepads, and apologies. A podcast producer offered to record a series of interviews. A public defender asked to volunteer. A retired judge, moved by her testimony, reached out and offered to mentor women who wanted to represent themselves in court. Danielle accepted help cautiously, not because she feared betrayal, but because she had learned the hard way that not all hands extended were offering support. Some came to take. But she knew she could not do it alone. She did not want to, because what she was building wasn't about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been told they were too poor, too black, too unqualified, too loud, too unpolished to deserve fairness. And she was tired of watching justice wear the face of the powerful while silencing the truth of the powerless. One evening, she was invited to speak at a community forum at the local university, an event titled Justice Reimagined, Stories from the Margins. The auditorium was packed. Students filled the aisles, professors lined the back wall, even Judge DeWitt sat quietly in a seat near the front row, her robe replaced with a beige sweater and jeans, her face unreadable. Danielle took the podium without a speech in her hands. She didn't need one. "My name is Danielle Brooks," she began, voice steady, eyes unflinching. "I stood alone in court because no one believed me. Not the police, not the prosecutors, not even my own lawyer. I was presumed guilty, not because of evidence, but because of who I was. A black woman. A working mother. A nonprofit manager without a degree in law, without a network of wealthy friends, without protection." She paused, letting the words settle like dust. "I cleared my name. Not because the system worked, but because I refused to let it destroy me. And I'm standing here now to tell you, this isn't just about one trial, one woman, one injustice. It's about every gate that was built to keep us out. It's about every courtroom where truth gets strangled by arrogance. It's about every prosecutor who mocks instead of listens. Every judge who assumes instead of questions. Every institution that builds walls where there should be bridges. The crowd was quiet, completely still, as if the air itself had leaned in. Danielle leaned forward slightly. And that's why I started Reclaim Justice. Not to fight for just one case, but to fight for a new way to see justice. Not as something granted from above, but something demanded from below. By us. For us. After the event, a young law student named Aaliyah approached her, notebook in hand, eyes wide with admiration. "Ms. Brooks," she said breathlessly, "I watched your trial every day online. You're the reason I changed my major from business to criminal justice. I want to help people like you. I want to do what you did." Danielle smiled, not just politely, but genuinely, because she saw herself in the girl's fire. "You will," she said softly, "and you'll do it better. With training. With a system behind you. With people beside you." Aaliyah nodded, cheeks flushed with hope. Danielle handed her a card. "Come to the next meeting. We need voices like yours." But not everyone was clapping. Danielle began receiving anonymous messages. Emails with no subject line. Snide comments from former colleagues who thought she should be satisfied with the verdict and disappear quietly. "You made the system look bad," one message said. "No one likes a martyr with a microphone," read another. She ignored them mostly. But some nights, alone in her room, she felt their weight. Because part of her knew they weren't wrong. She had made the system look bad. Because it was. And she wasn't sorry. 1 month after her acquittal, Danielle stood outside the newly leased storefront that would house Reclaim Justice's first official office. The paint was chipped, the front sign still blank, the floor still dusty. But the space was hers. The mission was clear. The future, uncertain but finally hers to shape. She unlocked the door and walked inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty room. No jury here. No prosecutor. Just truth. And the will to build something the system could no longer ignore. Redemption doesn't always come in the roar of an apology. It sometimes arrives folded inside a quiet envelope, unsigned, but undeniable. The letter arrived on a gray Thursday morning, tucked between utility bills and a coupon flyer, its envelope plain, its handwriting sharp, almost too formal. Danielle Brooks stood in her kitchen, a half-made breakfast growing cold behind her, as she turned the envelope over twice, hesitating, then slowly peeled it open with one steady motion. The first line read, "I was wrong." She sat down slowly, her legs trembling not from fear, but from the shock of what followed. "I misjudged you. I dismissed you. I assumed you were guilty because you didn't look like someone who should be standing at a defense table, let alone defending yourself. I used the weight of the state to try to silence you, and in doing so, I exposed everything I had forgotten about what this job is supposed to mean." It wasn't signed, but Danielle didn't need a name. The tone, the wording, the guilt etched between every syllable. It belonged to Jason Rourke. "Your closing statement haunts me more than the verdict. Because you didn't just win, you exposed every crack in the floor I used to stand on. I built a career on confidence, on control, on quick wins and clean headlines. But what you did, it wasn't just brave, it was just. And it made me ask myself who I've become." Danielle's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not out of restraint, but because her tears had been used up in the fight. What filled her chest now wasn't anger or triumph. It was clarity, a knowing that went deeper than victory. The letter continued, "If you ever decide to teach, to train, to guide others, I hope you know that there are people like me who should be learning from you." It ended without a name, without a return address, just those final words hanging in the air like a quiet offering. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a folder labeled Testimonies, and slid it into the drawer of her desk at Reclaim Justice. Not because she forgave him, but because even the guilty can grow. Weeks later, Danielle stood before a new audience, this time at a youth justice summit, filled with high school seniors from underserved communities, some of whom had already experienced the system's sharp edges, some of whom carried invisible scars left by profiling, evictions, suspensions, or the simple burden of being too black, too loud, or too brave in rooms that demanded silence. She held the microphone loosely, her voice warm, but weighted. When I was accused, she said, I thought justice meant being believed. But I've learned something deeper. Justice means being heard. It means that your voice, your truth, your life can't be edited out just because someone in power doesn't like what it reveals. She paused, scanning the young faces looking back at her, many of whom now sat on the edge of their seats. The prosecutor who tried to break me, he sent me a letter. He didn't apologize for the system. He didn't claim innocence. But he acknowledged the truth. And for someone like him, that's a kind of justice too. The crowd murmured, not loudly, but with a weight that suggested they understood. She continued, justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about change. About who steps up after the fire and says, never again, not on my watch. The applause started slow, not because it was uncertain, but because it was reverent. Not for a hero, but for a survivor who had become a builder. As she left the building that night, a teenager approached her, no older than 16, hands tucked into an oversized hoodie, voice low. You think someone like me could win like you did? Danielle didn't smile. She looked him in the eye and said, if you speak the truth and never let them scare you into silence, you've already started winning. And now, to you, yes, you watching this right now. Danielle's story isn't just one woman's courtroom triumph. It's a mirror held up to a justice system too often tilted against the voiceless. It's a reminder that dignity does not require permission, that truth does not require a degree, and that sometimes, justice walks in with braids, no legal team, and a fire that refuses to die. So if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of Danielle's words or the sting of her silence, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that justice can still rise from the ashes. Like it if you believe in the power of truth spoken without fear. And subscribe if you want more stories that don't just entertain, but shake the ground beneath injustice. Because the next Danielle Brooks could be watching right now, wondering if her voice will ever matter. Let's make sure she knows it already does.